And now we'll see what we've learned. So we're circling back in many ways. We have a week looking ahead. The week looking ahead, we're looking at themes on how you might address institutional corruption, a final 2 sections on remedies. But today, in many ways, we're kind of beginning where we started, where we're getting back at home. Here in the academy, we began by thinking about, when we talked about the purpose of institutions, one easy institution at the beginning of the semester we thought we could talk fluidly about as having clear purposes was the academy, the universities. And we're all, of course, embedded in universities, students, professors. This is an area we should know a lot about. If anything can be said about modern universities, though, is they're extremely complex. Sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, even within administrations. There's many different schools, departments, students, types of students, degree programs, interests, public interests, private interests, consumer interests, provider interests. And to help us today in thinking about how the academy looks and some of its characteristic vulnerabilities, as well as how we think about its values and purposes, we have a sociologist of the academy, Gary Gray, who's going to be up here in the second half of the course. And Gary has spent the last 3 years doing interviews with a lot of institutions, particularly elite institutions in America, talking to administrators, talking to lab directors, talking to students, talking to people who have different perspectives on what's working and what isn't, and some of the dangers that lie ahead. What I want to do at the outset, though, is think about the universities in a bit of a historical perspective and see if we can identify, going into Gary's talk, what are some of the things that should be on our radar screen. So we'd asked at the beginning of the semester, what are the purposes of the university? Just put some out there. There's 2 or 3 big ones. Yeah. So student education, educate them in what? So, yeah. Things that are true. So true education. What else?
The expansion of knowledge.
So discovery of fundamental information and the communication of that to new people. Okay, I think these are good to get us started. And the particular theme of this week is the corruption of knowledge, thinking about both its production and dissemination and how it might be corrupted. When we talk about knowledge, last week, or the previous session, we thought about 2 other sources of knowledge we have that are very important for society. One being journalism. This is how we get a lot of our daily understanding of events. This motivates all sorts of political movements and it disciplines people in power. And we thought about some of the financial interests that might compromise journalistic integrity, everything from subscribers to owners to paid media content providers. We also thought about think tanks, this sort of interesting hybrid between journalistic public policy advocacy organizations and something like real scholarship, objective, disinterested, dispassionate analysis and objectivity. And today we're finally moving, hopefully, the most into that domain of objectivity, dispassionate analysis, truth, and light. But when we think about knowledge, so classically, many people claim knowledge. And what knowledge actually is has been subject to a long debate. One, going back to the Greeks, was this wondering whether knowledge was just doxa, was it just opinion? How do you separate opinion, advocacy, rhetoric, a desire to persuade from actual truth, what the Greeks would distinguish from this other word, episteme, commonly translate that in Latin terms as veritas, so truth. That the knowledge we're after is not just doxa and opinion, the kind of things you can persuade a kindergartner of or a gullible reader, but you actually, at the end of the day, the idea here is that the knowledge that actually provides real power or the control of knowledge that should provide power, we want to be linked to truth, so veritas in some way. And the question arises, so why would you be against truth? Who would be the enemies of truth? Why would anyone be against that? And we can suggest a few reasons people might be against the truth, and we can also suggest how that might be actually institutionally revealed or recognized within higher education. So this is a beginning sentence of an important work. The author says, if all who are engaged in the profession of education were willing to state the facts instead of making greater promises than they can possibly fulfill, they would not be in such bad repute with the lay public. Anyone recognize that? If you don't recognize the exact author, have an idea on who might have said it? What kind of person, interest group, time period? Yeah.
Emerson?
Okay. Emerson's a good guess. So Emerson's a great guess. Emerson actually at one point gives a commentary on this. So this is actually Isocrates' treatise against the sophists. So it appears in the 4th century before Christ. And in the ancient world, these questions about who knows something and who's worthy to teach it and who should be paid for teaching it were very alive and well, partly because there's this question of education is deeply embedded with who should rule. So you want the wise people to rule. You want questions about how do you get wisdom in politics. And particularly the Athenian period, you have all these debates about who are the real teachers, who are the sophists, who are the people who are exploiting others. And a common accusation is that you have these teachers going around and they're basically teaching bullshit, but they're charging a lot of money for it. And students are these innocent, students by definition are ignorant. They don't know what they don't know. So they go ahead, they pay these tuition fees, and at the end of the day, they get these inferior or counterfeit goods. They get pretend knowledge rather than true knowledge. He talks about professors who've gone so far in their lack of scruple that they attempt to persuade our young men that if we'll only study under them, they'll know what to do in life, and through this knowledge become happy and prosperous. More than that, although they set themselves up as masters and dispensers of goods so precious, they're not ashamed of asking for them the price of 3 or 4 minae. And he says, look, either this is grossly mispriced. Either if this is going to give you knowledge and happiness, this should be really expensive, and very few people should afford it. Or if it's actually not worth anything, these professors shouldn't be able to make a living. So this is a debate that goes back very long about whether it can pay to serve something other than the truth. And the thought that the sophists in ancient Greece are people who make their living by peddling half-truths, by appealing to rhetorical and emotional manipulation, but don't have any real knowledge. And this question about are our higher institutions of learning exploiting students is going to be one set of concerns. Beyond the financial incentives of bending the truth to sell a inferior good, there's a long recognition that untruths can be useful. This is a famous passage in the Republic. Plato talks about what's sometimes translated as the noble lie, talking about the education of the guardians. We're going to tell them myths about why they're good, about their calling in life, about how good and bad will be punished. And in Socrates' debate with others, they say, well, that's not quite true, is it? And he says, well, and they ruminate on whether it'd be okay to tell untruths if they serve some social good. And this is mirrored in a lot of debates in the 20th century, particularly ideological debates about the role of the academy in promoting different ideological visions. So, classically, the educational programs called for in various fascist and communist regimes in the early 20th century have a great deal to do about the control and production of knowledge. You have propaganda, various forms of censorship in totalitarian regimes. The question of how knowledge is produced is a very important political one, and whether you can manipulate people through by controlling the knowledge is also a central concern. So, what's a fact and how does that get produced is an important question. I think there's a thin red line that runs between discovering knowledge and using that power because you've made a genuine discovery and trying to control knowledge and getting power because of that control. And this is something that we're going to want to think about in terms of when we see different sorts of conflicts coming up. Is the fundamental allegiance of a university to truth, to producing new knowledge, or can truth be bent in various ways to serve other interests that aren't primarily interested in truth? Again, the way in which institutions get embedded in these debates, in these political debates and truth debates also goes back a long time. There's Cambridge up top, Oxford down low, Larry's place and my place respectively. There's a puritanical place that doesn't surprise me, Larry, that you would be hailing from that institution. Oxford was in the English Civil War allied with the Royalists and is extremely, what's that?
That doesn't surprise me.
No, it doesn't, yes. They eat their vegetables up there. Political movements have been, closely aligned with universities as well. and the control of knowledge has worked the way out institutionally there. In the English Civil War, these two camps sort of had not only their military bases, but they had their intellectual bases. And this is something that has been a central concern in the development of knowledge and institutions of higher learning over the last 300 or 400 years in the modern era, as to these intellectual battles about the nature of truth. Now, there are these political battles. There's also been epistemic battles. So the major epistemic battles in the modern period, we would think about the trying to figure out what science is, what is true knowledge, scientia, and classically our originary thinkers on that, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes in some tellings. These are people that said, look, our academies are corrupt because they've been dominated by different schools of thought, false understandings of inquiry, Aristotle and Schoolmen, Averroist philosophies, and you see this major shift, this battle working out in the early modern period, trying to say, no, there's a different mode of inquiry, and this is essential for knowledge. So this becomes one debate. And certainly one of the fruits of that is we think of science and the scientific method as one method of objectivity in the university. And we have various canons that we think we can enforce institutionally to preserve science as a sort of a practice with integrity that's objective and that doesn't bow to various other pressures that would be untruthfulness. Another central idea that emerges within what we can call broadly the Enlightenment is this idea of an open society. So at least up till the 18th century, most countries in the world have explicit censorship rules, explicit prohibitions on publishing. John Milton famously speaking in favor of letting presses publish without government control in his Areopagitica gives a view of toleration and open debate which comes to be dominant in our modern era, which is to say, let truth and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth to be put to worse. She needs no policies, nor stratagems, nor licensings to make her victorious. Those are the shifts and the defenses of the errors that use against her power. So if you just let truth into the debate, if you let everybody have a discussion, have a debate, truth is going to rise to the top, error will be cast out. All you need is an open debate. So this idea of an open society was both a political project, but it was also thought to be a university policy, that this is actually going to be a path to true knowledge, that all we need is open and free debate, and the truth is going to win out. There's famously a academic essay contest at the Academy of Dijon in 1750. It asked this question: has the progress of the sciences and the arts contributed to the corruption or the improvement of human conduct? So two questions. Well, I think we can say that the bulk of the Enlightenment says yes, that this is exactly what's happening in human civilization right now. We're getting out of the Dark Ages. We're coming into a period of self-understanding, and that it's precisely the corruption of the past that's going to be overcome through the knowledge and this progress in science and the arts. Rousseau's, and this turns into Rousseau's first discourse, is published in response to this question, who says no, and this begins also a long debate about what are the limits, both to scientific inquiry and the progress of the arts, and is the picture more complicated? We're not going to talk about Rousseau today. We're going to fast forward to where we are at the moment and thinking about the public role of universities today in light of some of these historical battles about the nature of the truth and how we achieve it. I think if you talk to President Faust, she will say, as well as I think any other college administrator today will say, there are at least two very important components, or maybe more, of what universities do today. One is economic. So you educate a workforce, you enable students to develop valuable skills that are going to be extremely important to an economy. And we talk about research. You discover things that are going to motor innovation, they're going to motor technologies that would be impossible to discover from just people working on their own. There's also continuing political use of universities. They help us have common understandings of complex social institutions. And ideally, although this is contentious for all sorts of reasons, they might enable ethical and moral reflection that ends up guiding people's lives better later on when they become leaders of various institutions. So that's, I think, the 10,000-foot view of the way where education has come from and the way it's conceived of a lot today. So the question is, how can universities fail at their mission? With these things sort of laid out, I'd like to get us to begin a sort of list of what are some of the vulnerabilities, the worries that we should have in the back of our minds as we think through some of the case studies and interviews that Gary's going to talk about? What are you all worried about? You're here. Are you just all you're content? You think things are fine? Maybe. And by the way, things probably are fine for you all. You're doing really well. Harvard's a good place. Yes.
I guess producing skewed research or producing research that serves the interests not of kind of academic pursuit or of the truth, but rather business interests or other financial interests.
Okay, so you're not. Is it false research that you're worried about, or?
I mean, that is a problem also. Like, there have been a few famous cases at Harvard of like blatantly false research, but I guess I was talking more about research that's that doesn't kind of start from a blank slate of what forms of important inquiry are, but are like targeting specific interests.
Okay, so it'd be we're trying to discover things that aren't really high impact. They're not really important for ideas, society, but they are some little piece of a puzzle that serve a financial interest. So, say wrong priorities. Okay. Yes.
This is sort of in that vein, just producing maybe valuable workers, but not the workers that society needs. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So wrong skills.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have to see what the right skills are, but okay, yes. Actually, I'll go 1, 2, 3. You're done. Yes.
Going along with biased research, research is biased by like industry funding. When academics are dependent on industry funding for their research, they're more likely to create results that are like.
Yes. So say narrowly focused by industry. Yep.
Suppose the idea that you're taking, universities have a large number of very impressionable young minds that are, really worried that they could potentially be dogmatic in their teaching, influence the way in which the future generations.
So indoctrination of some, say, ideologically suspect kind.
Self-censorship of research, so not doing research.
So say more about what sort of self-censorship? You have an example in mind?
Not a concrete example, but for example, if a professor wanted to research something controversial, and I don't believe that the institution would support them, they might just not pursue that track at all.
Mm-hmm.
Consistent or skewed evaluation of the students.
So grading that's not accurate.
Weird grading.
Weird grading. We usually just throw people's papers down the steps and see which one comes out first, but you're thinking weirder than that. Okay, but assessment strategies that you think are they don't track genuine merit, genuine ability, but they're somehow either they're capricious or maybe they're playing favorites, or there's some way in which academic merit isn't tracked in grading and shortchanging students because of that. I know there's a lot of hands up now. Okay, let's go this way. So 1, 2, 3.
Trying to follow success and worrying about the societal implications of that, and seeing what Harvard has been doing in terms of trying to divest or not divest.
So say more. Your word.
So if we're trying to look at what it means to be successful, or what it means to be successful, and then looking at what Harvard values and what Harvard is willing to condone to achieve its mission or its needs, and using that as our own model.
So I'm hearing two things. One is that you're worried that you might indoctrinate certain ideas of success, that this might be part of the indoctrination, that everyone thinks they need to do a certain thing because that's in vogue right now, and that universities reinforce that. Then there's this other question of, it's sort of a financial, if I get a question about the universities are big institutional players in our economy, in our polity, and that their power might be abused just as sort of political institutional actors. Is that fair enough, or there's something else I'm missing there?
So when we have, like, I guess when we have moral trade-offs and like looking at how the university
Mm-hmm.
plays itself in those situations, and then modeling how we ourselves can make those decisions based on the university.
Yeah. So President Bach in that one thing talks about how can we lecture students about not cutting corners if we as a university are willing to bend over backwards to accommodate this interest or that interest. So a problem of modeling behavior there as well. Yes?
Other administrative policies that affect like the regular lives of students, like I'm specifically thinking of sexual assault policies.
Uh-huh. So they have, basically we have these are actually like huge residential communities. These are like little towns. And you could think of various ways of abuse or say misplaced priorities. So all the political problems we have in a regular city are kind of recapitulated on a university campus. So let's say policies that are in students' best interests.
I was going to say that when university makes decisions that align with the rest of the student body or staff, and like in order to make money or stuff.
We have this question of authority, of who deserves in this community have final say over a lot of things. You're paying customers, you're a part of the community, but whose other interest ought to be legitimately traded off. So we have this question of authority here.
Corrupt admissions practices.
Admissions,
yeah.
Okay.
Let's say admitting development candidates whose parents might give vast amounts of money to the school, even if they're not qualified in the same way the majority of other applicants would be.
Okay, so this question about how we're distributing valuable social goods, and we're wondering whether that should be meritocratic or not.
Actually, all sorts of policies can be swayed by donors, so just kind of focus on endowment returns.
Okay. Yeah, it's 1, 2, 3.
Also, I think also it's important to think about the university's mission and how it relates to people that aren't necessarily like members of the university's communities. So,
Okay.
well, just like one example is just as many universities are nonprofit institutions, and so they receive tax exemptions. And that means that like the kind of local community isn't necessarily benefiting from the university's presence. So does that create some kind of responsibility to the community around the university? And then also just more broadly, like how things that are created within the university are made available to people outside of the university.
Yeah, so my understanding is there's a bunch of people in Alston who are really pissed because Harvard began some stuff there and kicked some people off this and that, and then they kind of held back. And so there's this question about their mission, but also its impact, the impact of the larger community, and also who has authority to be part of that discussion process. Yep.
So, along with the policies, but not necessarily, enacting policies that are in students' best interest, but allowing for an environment within the university which could be obviously very harmful to students, or is just clearly not within the institution's mission. So,
Yeah.
if there's just a level of apathy for what should actually be going on in the institution, then you can definitely fail there.
Okay, so the community environment.
In general, just a misalignment with the professor's mission, comparing with like what students want to get out of university.
Uh-huh.
I know it's the professor's job to put out research, and they're hired to be researchers, but
That's all we care about.
That's
Yep.
at the expense of the students who get these professors who don't actually care about teaching. So that's the thing that I would be worried about.
That's right. Yes. You all are not at a liberal arts college where. No. That's okay. It's there might be an aspect of truth. So what? We'll get to this in a moment. On the other side. But what percentage of Harvard's operating revenue each year comes from tuition? Do you think? So we have the full budget that's spent at Harvard, whatever that is. $4.5 billion or something like that spent each year here. How much of that comes from tuition fees? So we have a 60%? 6%. Oh, okay. Very good. So we really don't need, students are like a little, so we have one guess at 6% in terms, you all pay a lot of money, right? 30%?
Is this accounting financial aid or not?
Hmm?
Accounting financial aid or not?
Yes, so in fact, that's true. Yes, so actually counting the financial aid that's given as revenue from students. So all over told. It's about 20%. It's about 20%. So it's interesting that students are a minority player in the financing of a lot of major research universities, but I think arguably, they're essential and core to the university's mission, at least its education mission. So how you balance their financial weight off of the mission weight, I think, is going to be a recurrent concern as well. So anything else to put on this list?
I guess Harvard might not be guilty of it, but then for like for-profit universities, we kind of use the mission of like imparting skills to like store students.
Yes, so this is a variation on the Isocrates claim that you might have seeking of profit, corrupting the kind of things that are taught, the quality of education. Is anyone worried that Harvard or any university, they have all these good things and they can't get enough money? We've talked about ways in which money might buy us what's done, but you can also imagine a lack of resources, a lack of money, the financial crisis, for example, all of a sudden tying Harvard's hands and a lot of universities' hands simply because they can't get, let's say, not just profit, but revenue in general. This is a pretty good list. This is actually, wow, this is more than a lot of our colleagues, I think, come up with when they think about these issues. I want to give a snapshot of a few, just lay out some of the larger national statistics on this before we get to some of Gary's more in-depth work. This question of whether students are getting their money's worth has come up a lot recently, in part because this is a graph that's causing many people concern. So you have the consumer price index, so general growth of inflation, that sort of things. This is a housing bubble. And as you'll notice, tuition has been going up even more than houses did in the lead up to the financial crisis. You can see this in a sort of different way here, looking at, this is, you've heard of growth in medical expenses. Those have been going up. But tuition is going up even faster. And this is the 5 quintiles of income. So even the top, the richest people, here's how their income growth looks, and here's the growth of tuition. So people have wondered, are there analogies to be drawn in terms of the incentive structures and the products between this and the financial crisis? And one reason this concern is magnified is this is a graph of federally secured student loan debt, which it's quite they call that a hockey stick in Canada and Canadian economics, I think. But it turns out, yes, in the last 15 years or so, an absolutely massive rise in the amount of debt that students have taken on. And there's now about $1.2 trillion worth of outstanding. This is just federal student debt. You can get private student debt, as I'm sure many of you know as well. So $1.2 trillion of outstanding student loans. This is the second largest form of consumer debt out there now. It wasn't the case 10 years ago. So the second major form of debt. And also, many forms of debt, if you go through bankruptcy, the debt is expunged. So various sorts of medical illnesses, you have a terrible medical problem and you don't have insurance and you lose all your money and you go through bankruptcy, you have credit card debt, et cetera. Bankruptcy expunges a lot of those. Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe educational debt in many circumstances does not get expunged. Yes, so you can't get rid of that.
Before circa 1994 there, where you have the long straight line, is that because there were no federal programs or just because the amount of money they lent out was minimal?
I think, yes, so I think it's a combination. There are federal programs. It's much less. And there was, I researched this very question like 8 months ago when I was giving a different version of this slide. The short answer, though, is that you get massive, huge federal incentives. There are federal loan guarantee programs, but you get major legislative changes that make financing of education a much more important thing, and you have banks given incentives to work with the government in figuring out these loans. So this should not be interpreted as a zero. It should be a minimal, but the change is what this graph is mostly trying to communicate. Yes?
This rule degree level.
So yes, these are both. So these are any student loan that you can qualify with, which in the United States would include undergraduate, graduate, master's programs, PhD programs, et cetera. So this could be cause for concern if you have massive buildup of debt and the question about the quality of what's being provided, a massive increase in actual expenses. But when you ask the question, is college a good investment? The answer still continues to be a resounding yes. So basically every econometric study of this says degrees are on average worth it. Now it depends a lot on which degree you get. And this is, we might ask about what do students know and what are the incentives to get them into useful degree programs. But by and large, if you just want to take a 10,000-foot view of this, there is a positive return on investment for the average student. And the question is this sufficient enough to justify a number of the trends and where they're headed? So why have costs gone up for so much? I'll give some very brief explanations you're all familiar with. You have a lot of great student amenities. We want to take care of you guys. And again, this is characterizing academia as a whole. And I think Harvard in many ways is just exceptional. So the Harvard, thinking of Harvard in your mind might not be the best analogy for some of this stuff. You have extreme amenities. This is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They have some luxury dorms. They're able to charge higher rent on and high demand from students. Unless you have, yes, a pool and washing machines, you can't attract. And then there's also, which you encountered already in this course, spending on athletic programs. And as has been noted, the fact that only 7% of D1 programs actually make money. So a lot of competing sources of expenditures. And as you all might have heard as well, you have a lot of administrative growth. So a lot more deans, sub-deans. You've probably interacted with some of these people in various capacities. You can judge what you think is their worth. Part of their need, though, is universities are really complex. So it turns out administering a $4.5 billion budget actually requires a lot of people to do planning, to do coordination. There's a debate amongst faculty about whether they resent being governed by increasingly large amounts of administrators. Some recent books and studies of that. Another dynamic leading to the growth of educational expenses is what's known as a Balmo effect. So you have anybody who teaches at a university, certainly like Harvard or in any of the, say, top 100 universities, they have skills that are really valuable. They're smart people. They could be profitably employed elsewhere. So there's a question of who else would pay their salaries, and do universities have to match those? And at the end of the day, does it make sense to have really, really smart people spending a good portion of their week talking to 19-year-olds about confused basic concepts? Should we just hire a bunch of TS for that? But Mark Hannon's not cheap. I'm going to put that on his. He'll be listening to this later, but he's great. But I think there's going to be a balance and limit to how do you think about quality class size and reaching students with quality education versus the scale effects. So this is just at Harvard, different courses by schools. As you know, at FAS, this class is an exception, but you have a lot of small classes. And that's, there's a question of whether that's, is that appropriate? Probably for Harvard, yes. Is it appropriate for other schools that are under more financial pressure? Maybe or maybe not. Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist at Duke, recently weighed in on this debate and pointed out that in his opinion, college is actually a bargain at $61K a year. He went through the actual cost of running a campus. He says this is basically a little city that you get to own for 4 years. And he goes on to look at the actually returns to most degree programs and says this is a great return on investment. Double-digit returns, super good deal. The more sobering, though, fact in the background is that when you look at the returns to, I think this is a bachelor's degree, that these returns have stayed pretty stable just as the tuition has continued to grow over the last 10 years. So this might inform how you think about whether students on a whole, again, probably not so much at Harvard, but at other institutions, are being sold an overpriced good, as Isocrates might have claimed, or whether maybe this is on balance a good deal for them. Whether you think this is corrupt or not depends on how you read that data. I'll note that there have been studies of collegiate learning that at different times suggest that a lot of students aren't learning that much. Again, not at Harvard. But you have this picture of basically, in the last 30 years, education has tripled in cost, and it's unclear whether the quality has also tripled in cost. Now, as I said, about 20% of the university's budget comes from students. So if you're concerned a lot about the education stuff, so what is the mission of a university? Is it providing good policies for students, community engagement, questions about admissions, questions about the quality of its product? You have a prima facie claim that the university should care, at least it should care 1/5 about students. But it also has an enormous amount of pressure to find money from other sources. So Harvard's very lucky. It has an endowment. How much does the endowment pay percentage-wise each year? Any ideas? Not quite 70, so 35% coming out of the endowment, about $1.5 billion coming from the endowment. And that's good. That's like, Harvard's very lucky. That means they don't have the pressure from strings attached to this. This is just sort of free money, but where does the rest come from? So where does the rest come from? So alumni-sponsored grants. So NIH, NSF would be government-sponsored grants, alumni, what else? Just from the readings and yeah. So patents, you can have commercialization of academically discovered products in a university. You can also have, related to that, various business ventures where a business puts up money in part of a patent discovery process. And there are, of course, there are private foundations. The interesting thing, though, is if you put these numbers up, so 20 and 35, it's only about half of the university that's coming from these sort of either student interest or low strings attached interests. But the other half has to come from somewhere, and that's where you might have various sorts of strings attached. Gary is now going to, this is the sort of big picture view, but Gary is somebody who's been in the trenches interviewing many of the stakeholders in academia, looking at many of the pressures they're under, and he's going to talk about some of the conflicts of interest and questions that arise.
What about the rest?
Gary, yes. We're going to think, yes. But yes, so we'll transition over here. But I think these are sort of the questions I wanted to set up of what are the other economies of influence within a university and how do they affect the quality of education and the production of knowledge. This. Oh, right there. Awesome. You have everything. Great.
Okay, thank you, Professor English, and also Professor Lessig for inviting me to speak with you today. Bill had mentioned the hockey stick up there. It's true, I am Canadian, so some of you may have difficulties understanding me today unless you're from Canada. For those who are not, obviously, you know the word A, which simply means right. It's cold out right. It's cold out A. But there's a few you probably will hear me say, and the one word is bean. And whenever I say I've been there, or it's been 20 years, people laugh at me. They, oh, you're Canadian, because I guess everyone says I've been there here. So that often identifies me as Canadian. And also the one I cannot shake is the word about. Whenever I say this word, people think I'm saying a boot, or they think I'm saying a boat, but I'm really saying about. And I tell people back home, they're like, we're not saying about, and we just get in this. But apparently, if you hear that, bear with me. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about conflicts of interest and institutional corruption in academia. But before I do that, just make sure there we go. Oh yes, before I do that, I have to give you a disclosure. And that's because, you know, I want to make sure that I'm being transparent today while I'm talking to you today. So first, I have provided legal testimony on the behalf of pharmaceutical companies. However, I've only keep half the amount of money because I do have to pay student debt, as Bill pointed out. I have quite a bit of debt. I'm from Canada, where the tuition's very high, much more than the US. And if only the Canadians here would get that one. Second, I have done paid lectures for private companies who are mostly against unnecessary regulations in their industry, primarily in the area of health and safety. But I did this mostly at a think tank in Canada. I no longer do this. And when I did this, I always read closely the lectures they provided with me, and I never felt that my integrity was being compromised ever. And finally, I'm currently involved in a large consulting project involving 2 major pharmaceutical companies who have recently faced a lot of legal troubles. So often you don't see professors give these sort of disclosures beforehand. So I wanted to ask if anyone had any questions about these disclosures before I continue. Yes. Yeah, they are definitely real. Well, let's have somebody who thinks I'm telling the truth ask me. Let's pretend that this is real. You know, I was thinking, am I going to fool a room full of Harvard students today? I know you psychologists are good at it. Sociologists are less good at tricking you, but I was trying. So for those of you, if there was anyone in here who actually believed me, great. I feel good. But let's pretend that this is real. So is there any questions you might have? Let's say someone puts this up. I mean, if I'm going to a doctor's office and they prescribe me a prescription, I hurt my shoulder last year, and they gave me a particular drug, I started thinking about all the work that I've learned at the Center for Ethics on institutional corruption, and I immediately wanted to ask the doctor, are you getting paid by the company that's prescribing this? Do you have some relationship? And I was torn by this, and I started to kind of want to ask, and that's when my wife just gave me this punch and says, just hurry up already, and I felt awkward and pressured, and I didn't ask, and I felt nervous. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay. Now, I'm going to say to you what my response was going to be if I had tricked you. And this is a response that I hear a lot in the interviews. Not everyone, but quite a few. And that is, oh yes, I do have these, but I'm able to put up a mental wall, this mental wall. And yes, I have my external things I do over here, but that does not influence my life as a professor or the research I'm doing, even if they may seem to be related. I'm able to be independent, and the psychologists often talk about this moral licensing aspect. I think it fits with a lot of people, but that's often what you would hear. Now, the surprise. But what is surprising is that what I described to you, even though I was just joking around, this is actually very common amongst a lot of professors. In fact, it happens all the time. The thing is, you just don't know this. And so you may actually have professors that are doing these types of things that are, maybe it's involved, maybe it's conflict, maybe they're able to put up a mental wall, maybe they're not. So what I'd like to ask is, how many people think that should professors have to disclose this information? Do you think they should disclose this type of information when they're giving a lecture if what they're talking about might be related? Like if, yes? And why do you think they should?
So that the students know that there's potential, if there is a relationship, that the professor could potentially be biased in what he's talking about.
Yeah? You're good in?
But I think partly evidenced by the fact that no one challenged you on any of these potential conflicts of interest. I don't think I think disclosure is important, but I don't think it really I think we really check off the box oh, they disclosed and therefore they're free from having these conflicts of interest, and I don't think it really completely fulfills the purpose that we perhaps wanted to.
Yeah, and you're right. I think even if there were people in here who believe me, they'd still stay silent. And when I ask people when they go to conferences and they do put this up, often nobody says anything anyway. And after a while, it becomes a bit of a formality. There was another hand? Yes?
I think openly disclosing it for kind of setting the stage of disclosure, I guess maybe helps with increasing trust, because if students or whoever
Yeah, that's good. And let's say, by show of hands, let's say what I put up was truly what I was doing. How many people here would feel a little better or more trusting knowing that I said this up front rather than you finding out later or never finding out? Okay. And likewise, how many of you, and you can answer again, you can agree with both. Let's say I put this up there. How many of you would now feel maybe less trusting and about the work I was about to present, even though I disclosed it? Okay, so in other words, you're not sure what to do with that information. What about this? Do you think students should have a right to know? Bill brought up a lot of good points about your education. Do you think students have a right to know about these types of things in the classroom? Let's do a show of hands. Okay, and does anyone think students should not have a right to know? I know this is the opposite, so even if you agree, you might feel awkward, but thank you. Why do you think maybe they shouldn't have a right to know?
Well, I think there's a weird sort of power that you give to the students that might undermine what you're trying to do. So, in the example, if you're a professor and you give me these disclosures, I automatically am sort of mistrusting of what you're saying. And then why are we in this relationship where you're trying to teach me something that I don't trust you? It makes me question the institution more as a whole. So whether students, whether they should have that right or not, I don't know if it's necessarily a question of right, more a question of that conflict shouldn't ever happen. There should never be a point at which a student would or wouldn't be mistrusting of their professor. And I think that burden maybe falls on the university itself a little more.
Oh, it's very nice. Thank you. Yes?
I wonder what maybe a coordinated sort of policy of disclosure, how that might change things. Because one thing that caused me to be distrustful is because I've never seen this before, and so I was sort of jarred by you having these connections. But maybe if this was a routine thing, then we would be able to, it would be more part of our discourse and more something that we would, I guess, develop a skill to understanding how to jarred.
Yeah.
Because it was required sort of for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. You and the person behind you. You first.
I think it's, student, when professors are teaching, they're there as a professor, not as like not primarily as a researcher or some other hat. And so I think like students don't necessarily have the right to know, like a right to know every single part of another person's, like professor's life, essentially, I think. Though, in an ideal world, like professor would be able to like switch hats and like have that compartmentalization, but like, I guess like, you're saying, in like reality, like the onus does fall on professors to determine whether.
Yeah. So there's a lot of gray areas. So, what do you have to disclose? So one last one.
I mean, ideally, I guess you're talking about a mixture of perspectives that don't represent biased perspectives all the time. But I think you do have a right to know the bias of who's talking to you because it helps you evaluate what they say. And even though you disclose that you might have these biases, I'm more trusting of you because now it's within my control to kind of assess what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so I think it adds to our education that we would be spoken to by people with biases as long as we can assess them based on that.
Yeah, and there's also, that's good, thank you. I'm going to move on, but there's also the aspect too. Imagine if you're coming to school for the first year, maybe, and you're wanting a job right after, and you're in a more of applied discipline, and you start seeing those disclosures like, hey, I could get a job. And so suddenly the disclosure too could have a different example. Like, you could walk into a class and a professor has all these, and maybe you have a summer interim job or something going on now, and then you see the professor who doesn't, and you're thinking, wow, this professor really can't provide me any opportunity. So I have sometimes heard a little bit of flip side. So it's nuanced. So appreciate all your questions. Thank you. How many people have heard of ghostwriting? Can anybody tell me what ghostwriting is? Yes, at the back there.
Having someone else write usually book, but not always book, and then publishing it either exclusively under your name or under your name with a small attribution to them.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets even better. They'll pay you. So you can imagine if someone came up and said, I will write the paper for Professor English's course. And not only that, you'll get an A, it could get published in a top journal in your field, and I will pay you $10,000. This happens, it's happened a lot over the years, different disciplines. It may still happen now, it's getting more frowned upon. But someone coming from sociology, this was a new thing. I'm like, you mean someone would pay? You just don't hear these types of things in certain disciplines. But in other disciplines, it is common, and you'll hear people describe that, well, actually, I look it over, so I still feel I'm an author. So there's a lot of different aspects to it. Now, the problem is when something goes wrong. And that's when, let's say, what was written in the article was actually not entirely accurate, or there was something left out, or maybe the article had a more marketing approach, so it neglected one thing, and then some scandal pops up. As you can see, there's lots of scandals around ghostwriting. So then what happens is suddenly you have a reporter coming up to the professor and saying, your article here said this, and it's leading to this problem. What do? Do you say, well, what happens is, well, I didn't write that article. And they'll be like, but your name is on it. So there's a lot of, so this is how a lot of these sort of scandals pop up. And how many people think ghostwriting is a form of cheating? So you think if you're a student, I can't have people ghostwrite, so why should a professor have the right to ghostwrite, perhaps? Yeah, so here's an example. So there is the ghostwriting. I'm saying that's a little bit debated, but here's some examples, just a couple of professors who would done what you think was more traditionally called cheating. And this is Diedrich Stapel from Tilburg University. And he's a famous social psychologist who's no longer working for the university. It's because he got caught making up 55 social psychology experiments. And so there's a great article in the New York Times when you're done this class, not now, check it out. It's called The Mind of a Con Man, and they interview him and all the pressures he had and why he cheated. Not to be outdone, though, there's a professor of anesthesiology in Japan who fabricated data in 183 publications, which is like the world record now. And the tough thing I have is I'm trying to remember the last 10 papers I wrote, or 15. Can you imagine 183 papers? So that's quite a bit. Now, these two people, like, we can call them bad apples, we can call them whatever, part of a bad barrel. But part of this course on institutional corruption is not focusing so much on the bad apples. It's trying to understand, as you know, people in everyday life maybe making decisions that are compromising things and they're not quite aware of it, or they are aware of it. So what I've been doing, as Bill alluded to, has been interviewing professors across the wide range of spectrum, from people who are just starting out to full professors who have been involved heavily in administration, so quite a wide distribution across 3 different universities, one private, one public in the United States, and one public in Canada. In total, 150 people. They were confidential interviews, so I would sit down with the person, talk. Often the interviews would last in 1 to 3 hours. One lasted almost 4 hours. Generally, an hour and a half would be the norm. We talk about everything in their experience, so their everyday lives as a professor, just, you know, from teaching, research, stresses about funding, just across the board. This resulted in about 10,000 pages of interview transcripts, which I'm going through in detail. And so this is quite a bit. So I'm described to you just imagine 150 people, but today I want to briefly describe a little snapshot on 6 different professors. And these are not their real names. From the nutrition departments, we have Professor Sensitive, Professor P. Good, the P stands for public, Professor Sugar, Professor Law, who are just coincidentally is from the law department, Professor Econ, again, coincidence, and Professor Smith from medicine. Now, as you go through this, I want you to think about which character you liked the most and why, and also which character you didn't like or you found like the villain, or however you want to frame it. And in doing so, I also want you to go back and think about the concept of dependence, corruption. And for a quick reminder, here's the slide Professor Lessig asked you to imagine at the beginning of the course, where it's pointing towards true north. And that's similar to magnetic deviation, where errors are produced on the compass due to local magnetic fields. We are all subject to improper influences that create distortions that lead us to be improperly influenced from true north. And that leads us all to the point that we should be guarding against improper dependencies, trying to recognize them in different institutions. In other words, they lead to what Professor Lessig has called dependence corruption. So keep the concept of dependence corruption in mind. Think about which characters you liked, which ones you didn't, as I go through the perspective of these different professors. Now, the reason Sensitive and P. Good are highlighted because I want to contrast them. Professor Sensitive, I sat in his office for 2 hours and 45 minutes, and we had this long discussion about everything under the sun dealing with his life as a professor. And so there's a lot of interesting things I learned. And afterwards, I went in Professor P. Good's office, and another hour and a half. And during this time, and it's important to say that these people are in the same department, same university, colleagues, right in the same local culture, but they had completely different perspectives on research and how things should be done. So, Professor Sensitive, and I'm going to read the quote and I'll put up a little insert of it, but I'm not going to put the entire quote up. So Professor Sensitive says, I have this development project. So listen to the quote, and then I want you to be able to, I'm going to ask your feedback, what you think between Professor Sensitive and Professor P. Good. So I have this development project. I'm working in a developing country, and part of what I'm doing is to commercialize and then ultimately industrialize the production of a particular product that is typically made in the home. So the first step would be then to commercialize it. And we would basically hire zillions and zillions of women to sit there and make the product. And then the second step is to industrialize it, which is to make a machine that makes it. Okay, so you could start to ask a lot of questions about that. Like, this is a product that most people make, that most women make in the developing country. They do this 2-3 times a day in their home. If I commercialize it, if I industrialize it, I take away their reason for being. And that's one way to look at it. On the other hand, if I industrialize it, I provide them an opportunity to do something else. And that's another perspective, right? So you take the same facts or the same information, and depending on the filter you use, you can come up with easily why you're doing something. Yes, I changed their culture, maybe. But that's happening anyway. I like to think that I'm sensitive enough to try to understand all those dimensions. So later that day, I'm now in Professor P. Good's office, and she talks about how now there's a bit of a push right now at the university to do international research with third world countries. She says, and one of our faculty members here, and of course I quickly figure out it's Professor Sensitive, is working on converting, in this country, their villages, certain families that create a product in the home. And for this little village, and they want to move that activity into a more Western type system where there's a big unit that does it in a big area on a large scale. And I just wonder where they've done this sort of social work, that sort of qualitative work beforehand to find out what moving this particular activity out of this family village is going to do to that village. It's going to change the economy and that product in that village for that family. And I guess what I'm trying to pick up on here is the idea that we can just waltz over to developing countries and it's going to make things better. And our faculty member, and Professor Sensitive, is working on one of these projects, and now his contact in the developing country is over here, and he wanted to talk to me, and I was going to ask him whether they had done any work beforehand to find out whether this change in the product was the way it's distributed and made, was this going to have any impact upon the economies of the smaller villages that would sort of lose out on this. These are sort of ethical concerns that are riding all the way through this, and you know, I think people vary in their attention to that. So, what do people think about this scenario? So what are your thoughts on Professor Sensitive? Is he doing anything wrong? Is this fine? So let's start first. What are your thoughts on Professor Sensitive? Any questions? How many people think what he's doing is perfectly fine? Is he doing anything unethical or illegal? No. So what is sort of the bigger picture this narrative is picking up on? Yeah?
I hesitate to use the word neocolonialism because I think it's too strong, but you could definitely say that it's hard to understand from a first world perspective the challenges faced by developing economies, especially if people who maybe aren't experienced with development economics or the like.
Okay. And are there any other thoughts? Yeah?
I think his idea that he could view his position objectively was a bit naive.
Okay.
It sounds a lot like what you were going to answer with the disclosure question.
Okay, excellent. So those are all three excellent points. Thank you. What do you think this is saying about higher education in general? About Professor English's earlier point, the point of a university, what it's meant to be? Is there sort of maybe some cultural norms being challenged now? Yes?
There's like an imposition of one way of thinking on another people and sort of an inability to question whether there's alternative perspectives.
Okay. So I wonder if you could just flesh it out a little more.
Like the way the professor's sensitive is, imposing this Western
Yep.
way of production on to another culture without sort of taking into consideration the things that this other professor is thinking about culturally, how will that work, sociologically, how will that work.
Yep.
And there might be, like, the best way in different places might be different.
And so so that true north, what might be some improper dependencies that are leading him to think like that?
I guess thinking about the economic ramifications of industrialization and sort of how heavily lucrative nature of that university.
Yep. Excellent. And as Professor Pegood said, the university is actually encouraging this type of behavior as well. So there's really nothing unethical or legal going on, according to Professor Sensitive. And if you go to a lot of universities now, you just start checking out their mission statements. Historically, as a professor as teacher, there's professor as researcher, and increasingly you're seeing professor as entrepreneur. And this model of a professor is being increasingly promoted in universities. So in many ways, Professor Sensitive is the one who's progressing, as Professor Pegood, who's staying back in the more traditional understandings of what a professor is. So there's different ways to look at that. Any other questions on these two before we move on? Okay. So the last professor, Professor Sugar. Now, before he says this, he says, I'm working on this chocolate thing. I mean, we're literally looking at energy efficiency. And now we're looking at how we might impact product quality. But I'm certainly not sitting here saying that I'm trying to make chocolate nutritional. I don't care about the nutritional aspects of it, quite frankly. That's not what this project is about. I don't have an ethical dilemma about that. Even if the company takes the product that I'm working on and whatever they're out there trying to sell as the latest health food. And now Professor Sugar goes on to say, that's not the point here of this project. The project has a defined boundary and everything like that. Once you start defining the actual problem and start collecting data, you have an outcome that you're working towards. And as long as I don't think I'm making something too harmful to people, I can say, okay, now my outcome is strictly how do I make this more efficiently? So question, what do you think about the way Professor Sugar is conducting science? Yes.
I think it's valid. I mean, like, not everything in academic research has to directly apply to, society. I mean, there's a lot of, basic science and basic research that happens for the sake of discovery and understanding. And so he defines his problem within those bounds and his purpose of his research is motivated by more fundamentally, and I think that's fine.
So he's doing his science perfectly. There's nothing wrong with.
Well,
I understand what you're saying. He's defining it. He's answering the question. That process he's going through. There's.
I guess what I'm trying to get more at is that process is motivated. It's motivated more for a fundamental understanding versus let's use this product for
Yeah.
X or something in society.
Yep.
And because that knowledge is presumably going to be out, so people can use that knowledge.
Okay. So more.
There's the other.
Yep. Totally. There's more applied aspect. Okay. I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, it just seems a bit jarring that a professor of nutrition doesn't care a lot about nutrition.
Yes.
Coming back to the idea of dependence, corruption, and purpose.
Mhm.
What is the purpose of the professor of nutrition? And what, therefore, he's advocating he doesn't care about nutrition, he's trying to make something more efficiently. That's a danger away from the original purpose of
And what sort of distortion or just change in the science might be taking place here? Can anyone pick up on that? Like, what's going on here that the way he's performing this test and what's being left out of this? Yeah?
Kind of seems like ghostwriting to me if the professor's purpose is to find something that's more efficient, and then it will later be applied and like put in the context of more nutritious. And like the professor's, or like the professor or the university's reputation might be attached to like the FDA, like when this is being applied, or like application to the FDA, for example.
Yes, and there were other examples where exactly what you're saying, that was a really explicit concern with some of the funding relationships. But anybody else on Professor Sugar? Think about, you are trying to understand this thing, but I'm being funded by these people, and clearly they want to be able to come out with the next brand, this, this efficiency chocolate bar, and then you see it, and you buy it, and you think you're being healthy. But maybe there's other problems, but you don't look. This is the question I'm going to lead to, and that's how I'm going to do it. So it's a sort of a distortion. It's called narrowing the analysis, and you're just focusing on that, and you're not looking at A, B, C, D, or E, just looking at B. And if you do that, you'll get to the answer to B. Well, the problem is, then it gets to the earlier question you were asked for this class, does that prevent truth or knowledge more generally from coming out? Okay, so I'm going to move on to Professor Law. Now, just give a little context on Professor Law. About 6 years ago, I started consulting in public work, policy work in developing countries with fragile economies. Most of my emphasis is on the technical reports rather than publishing academic stuff. Now, I'll draft the laws, or I'll work with people who draft the laws. I get to mediate between what Washington wants, the World Bank, and what will actually work in this local context. Now, during his work as a university professor who's also working as a consultant, a donor's chief of staff asked him to look at a proposal. And they basically wanted him to read it, sign off on it, and so they could get this grant. And now Professor Law quickly realized that this grant, which was for millions of dollars, would essentially just be going back to them, and there was no real development going to be taking place. They were just going to take this money. And so, of course, he said, no, I can't do this. But they tried to get him to change his mind by sending 2 guys to his hotel room where they physically threatened him. According to Professor Law, I was threatened in my hotel room by 2 thugs. However, he says he stood his ground and refused. They did not hurt him. And I asked him, so how did they threaten you then? He said, well, they were two pretty big dudes. They're screaming and yelling at me. And when you're still saying no, normally the next step is they're going to start hitting you. Well, that's not what they did. In fact, they turned around and offered him a bribe. And he knows they tried to bribe me with a significant amount of money, which is 2-3 times his salary. He turned that down. And he had the following to say when he left the hotel room. He said, the minute I walked out of that hotel room, I realized, it was the first time I ever realized how lucky I was to have tenure, because I have got a job for my whole life. And that helped me to say no. If I was a regular consultant worrying about my next contract, I don't know what I would have done. Now, Professor Law sounds very noble and it's great, but he did later say that everybody's got a price, and that he calculated at what point would he have said taken that bribe. And so, does anyone want to guess what he might have accepted the bribe for? How much money? This is a guess, so there's no right. 10 million? Any other guesses? 20,000. No, that was, sorry. No, he turned down a bribe that was way above that already. It was twice his salary. So he, no, it was significantly higher, yeah.
He calculated how much money he made from his tenure job.
He did. He did. So one last guess? Well, he was really old. No, he guessed, he said between 10 to 20 million. He factored in his reputation, getting fired maybe from the university or not getting fired, leaving, and what he could do. And he figured, I could be comfortable with 10 to 20 million. And so that was him. So I don't know. But it gets to the point. You have integrity, but at what point? Now, I won't ask everyone in here at what point they would pay off my student loan. What I described as bribery, and that's not really getting deep into the institutional corruption, but what Professor Law did describe was a ton of informal bribes. We can call these other things. We can just call these nudges, or if you don't do this, you know, you won't be back, you won't resume being a consultant here. And he said, there's expectation that you will go along with the institutional story, the institutional ideology. So you're going to put out a report that more or less says this. It was pretty clear to him. And he also talked about that, you know, there's a lot of pressures. He said that you can be pressured in a lot of different subtle ways to say no. And he says, if all you're just looking for is extra money, you'll just accept the bribes. Now, these are not bribes in what I'm talking about. He's referring to just bend a little this way, go along with the institutional story, and you'll continue to be a consultant. And he described quite a bit on how this was constant, because he'd always be renewed as a consultant, and they'd always be asking him things. And he's lost out on consulting gigs, but so it's always this little trade-off. Sometimes, you know, he'll distort things, but he's okay with it. Other times it crosses a line that he won't be able to do. Now, I want you to listen to Professor Econ's quote, and then I want to ask you a question about that contrast, Professor Law and Professor Econ. Professor Econ says, if you gain your knowledge of the world through relationships with organizations, you may see the world through that lens, the way it looks through the self-interested lens of that organization. It is possible for academics to be captured by the relationships they have. That may influence their perspective. On the other hand, these relationships actually give people knowledge, access, and detailed information they might otherwise lack. So how do you get a balance? He goes on to say, in the world of economics, there is a lot of public debate. It's not like in medical trials where you're essentially generating data through expensive experiments, which then may be suppressed. It's much more a matter of commenting on developments using whatever knowledge you have. So I think the process of public debate and discussion, which is what academia is all about, is a pretty good protection against this risk of capture. So my question here is thinking about the experiences of Professor Law and what he's describing. Do you agree with Professor Econ that public debate and discussion will balance things out? Why or why not? Like, what are some of the things, do you agree with that or don't agree with that? What are some of the things that maybe what Professor Econ is saying, that through debate, knowledge, everything will balance out? Yeah?
I think maybe that's right in an ideal case where the discussion is through equal voices on all sides, but we know very well that that's not the case, and that often those with the deepest pockets will have the loudest voice and are able to influence people to speak on their behalf. And it's hard to expect a balance when not everybody is at the same level of power.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Anybody else? Yeah?
This is also, I guess, the idea of like concentrated like benefits and business costs, where on one side they might have like huge benefit in order to try to push forward and get the experts to agree with them, whereas the other side, you know, they might not benefit so much and they don't spend as much time. That means that it leads to an imbalance of effectiveness.
Okay, great. Anybody else having a comment? Okay, so I'm not going to go into Professor Smith. If you'd like to see more about Professor Smith, you can check out this article. This is a medical school professor who had previously only NIH money, and he described a process of how he could do his science. It was pretty much hands-off what he described. And then he went into his first pharmaceutical relationship with a company, and he started working with the pharma scientists. And suddenly, how he did science suddenly started to change a little bit. For instance, he wasn't allowed to test sort of the procedures. When he was given a chemical compound, they wouldn't allow him to test that. And then even the company scientists wanted to do it themselves because they wanted to make sure what they had was actually accurate, but it turned out that it was tested from another parent company, different place, and so they weren't allowed to then test it because it would be a redundancy. You've already, business-wise, we've tested it. Why would you do that? So there's this constant like trust. Do we trust the data? We don't trust the data. And Professor Smith described this story about how he then secretly went and tested the data to maintain his own integrity and felt it was fine. But he would have gotten a lot of trouble. They wouldn't have been too happy with him. So if you want to check out Professor Smith's much more detailed narrative on how he in the field of medicine dealt with it. You can check that out. On your syllabus, there is this question. Knowledge is an important in a democracy, for it enables an informed public discourse to take place. To what degree do you think moneyed interest can mislead the public through biased research? And to what degree do you think that truth will win out over time if debate is allowed to play out? Now, Professor English gave you a nice historical analysis at the beginning that this is an issue that seems to be going on for quite some time. You've heard stuff on think tanks. You've heard stuff on universities now. I think you might be in a much deeper position to comment on this. And hopefully, when you're thinking about Professor Sensitive, Good, Sugar, Law, Econ, and eventually Smith, that'll provide you a little bit of insight into that. But I did ask you at the beginning which character you liked the most. I know it's limited information, and which one you liked the least. So does anyone want to tell me who did they like the most and why? Yeah?
I like Professor Law. It's like he stood up to the armed thugs. It was really like stand up for integrity. But then he admitted that he had a price.
Yeah, he was very honest. Like it was very thorough. This interview lasted a long time, so it was great. Did anyone else have a favorite other than Law? And Law was tough. He grilled me for the first 15 minutes. He thought maybe I was there spying on him from the university. I'm like, no, I'm not. Who did people like the least? Yep.
The econ professor kind of had this like arrogance that I think that in class we've seen in doctors saying like, oh, I would never be swayed in any way by pharmaceuticals suggesting anything, but my other colleagues might. And the way he talked about sort of the ideal public discourse in universities kind of made me dislike him.
Okay. Yeah, he gave the sort of the standard answer, truth will always balance out public discussion without getting into the nuances. Yep.
Professor Sensitive, first one.
Why not?
He did identify the research that I'm doing has these ethical dilemmas, but he just doesn't deal with them, or it doesn't justify one choice over another.
Yep.
Just accepts.
And the thing that's interesting about him is he's doing nothing unethical or illegal. He's doing actually what the university is now encouraging him to do. So that adds this other twist to it. Anyone else favorite, dislike? Okay. So that's it. It's 2:28. I'm letting you out early, 2 minutes. My thing wouldn't show up on this
Great.
end.
This is fantastic. So next week, Larry's leading us off with